Silence shattered as the heavy wooden gavel slammed down. Judge Clayton Montgomery smirked, ready to humiliate the young, unrepresented black woman standing before him with his notorious courtroom games. He thought he was playing a scared amateur. He didn't know he had just challenged a legal prodigy to a deadly game of chess. Camille Washington stood perfectly still at the defense table, her hands folded neatly over a worn manila folder. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light piercing through the high-arched windows of courtroom 302 inches, the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. At 24, Camille looked younger than her years, dressed in a conservative, off-the-rack navy suit that had seen better days. To anyone in the gallery, she appeared to be exactly what the prosecution claimed she was: a desperate, low-level paralegal who had been caught red-handed attempting to embezzle $3 million from Bancroft Financial. Judge Clayton Montgomery adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and peered down from the mahogany bench. Montgomery was a man who reveled in his own authority. Known among the local bar association as a tyrannical egotist, he had built a career on belittling public defenders and bulldozing pro se defendants, those foolish enough to represent themselves. He had a particular disdain for young minorities who dared to step into his courtroom without high-priced counsel, viewing them as easy targets to pad his reputation as a tough, no-nonsense jurist. Prosecutor Harrison Trent, a polished man in a $3,000 bespoke suit, leaned casually against the prosecution table. He had barely bothered to prepare for the hearing. In his mind, crushing a pro se defendant who lacked a law degree was equivalent to stepping on an ant. "Miss Washington," Judge Montgomery's voice boomed through the microphone, dripping with condescension. "I see you have waived your right to counsel, a bold choice for someone facing 20 years in federal prison for corporate fraud. Are you quite sure you don't want me to appoint a public defender? I'm sure someone is available to hold your hand through this." Camille looked up, her expression a mask of polite deference. "I am sure, Your Honor. I will be representing myself." Montgomery chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the silent room. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Very well, but let me warn you, Miss Washington, I do not tolerate amateurs wasting my court's time. In fact, when I deal with pro se defendants in my courtroom, I like to play a little game to expedite the process. I call it truth or lee." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The court reporter, a seasoned woman named Brenda Hayes, paused her typing, her eyes widening slightly. Montgomery's truth or lie game was an open secret in the courthouse, a highly unethical intimidation tactic he used to force defendants into cornering themselves on the record. "The rules are simple," Montgomery continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I will ask you a question regarding the prosecution's evidence. You will answer. If I determine you are telling the truth, I might show you some leniency when it comes to scheduling and bail. If I determine you are telling a lie, I will hold you in contempt of court, deny your bail, and strike your pending motions from the record. Do we have an understanding?" Prosecutor Trent snickered softly. It was a blatant violation of judicial neutrality, but Montgomery had been doing it for years, and the appellate courts had historically turned a blind eye to his unorthodox courtroom management because he delivered swift convictions. Camille's dark eyes locked onto the judge. Beneath her calm exterior, an intellect of staggering proportions was rapidly calculating probabilities. Camille was not merely a paralegal. She possessed an eidetic memory, an IQ of 168, and had secretly completed a rigorous, unaccredited legal apprenticeship program, passing the bar exam in 3 different states under a sealed academic waiver by the age of 21. She had taken the lowly job at Bancroft Financial merely to secure corporate health insurance for her terminally ill mother. While working there, she had accidentally uncovered CEO Richard Bancroft's massive offshore money laundering syndicate. When Bancroft realized she knew, he had framed her for embezzlement, using his high-powered connections to ensure she faced the draconian Judge Montgomery. "I understand the rules of your game, Your Honor," Camille said softly, her voice trembling just enough to sound thoroughly intimidated. "But, if I may ask, how do you determine if it is a truth or a lie?" Montgomery scoffed. "I am a federal judge, Miss Washington. I have presided over this court for 15 years. I have a built-in lie detector. I look at the evidence Mr. Trent has provided. I look at your demeanor, and I decide. My word is final. I see, Camille replied, looking down at her scuffed shoes. Then I am ready to play, Your Honor. Excellent, Montgomery beamed, relishing the power trip. Let's begin. Prosecutor Trent's affidavit states that on the night of October 14th, you used your security keycard to enter the Executive Financial Archives at 11:42 p.m., bypassing the primary firewall to access the Cayman accounts. Truth or lie? Camille hesitated, biting her lower lip, playing the part of the cornered prey perfectly. It is the truth that my keycard was used to access the archives, Your Honor, but it is a lie that I was the one holding it. Montgomery slammed his hand on the desk. Lie! The security logs clearly show your badge number. Are you telling me a ghost used your card, Miss Washington, or are you just insulting my intelligence? Your Honor, if you look at the... I said, lie, Montgomery interrupted, his face flushing red. Strike her motion for a bail reduction from the record. Remand her to custody for the duration of these preliminary proceedings. Trent smiled triumphantly. The game was rigged, and the judge had just handed the prosecution an easy victory. Your Honor, Camille spoke up, her voice suddenly losing its tremor, ringing out clear and steady. Before the bailiffs take me, I would like to make a formal request on the record regarding the rules of your truth or lie assessment. Montgomery frowned, annoyed by her persistence. Make it quick. I request that, pursuant to the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 104, your determinations of truth or lie in this preliminary hearing be considered binding judicial admissions for the remainder of this trial. If you are going to substitute your judgment for a jury's fact-finding at this stage to deny my bail, then the prosecution and the defense should both be bound by the absolute finality of your determinations going forward. Trent frowned, stepping forward. Objection, Your Honor. That's highly irregular. The judge's assessment of her credibility right now shouldn't bind the evidentiary phase of the actual trial. Montgomery held up a hand, silencing the prosecutor. The judge's ego was massive, and Camille had just appealed directly to it. She was essentially asking him to cement his own absolute authority over the facts of the case. Overruled, Mr. Trent, Montgomery declared, puffing out his chest. If Miss Washington wants to hang herself with my rulings, I will gladly supply the rope. The court recognizes my determinations of truth or lie in this hearing as binding judicial admissions. Bail is denied. We begin evidentiary hearings tomorrow morning. As the bailiffs approached to escort her away, Camille lowered her head, hiding the sharp, predatory smile that curled at the corners of her mouth. Judge Clayton Montgomery had just swallowed the bait. He had no idea that he had just legally bound the court to a set of rules that Camille was about to weaponize against him. Morning broke over the courthouse with heavy, gray clouds, casting a somber mood over courtroom 302. Camille Washington sat at the defense table, having spent the night in a holding cell. Despite the wrinkled state of her suit and the dark circles under her eyes, her mind was razor-sharp, functioning like a supercomputer, processing millions of variables per second. The gallery was surprisingly full today. Word had spread through the courthouse about the arrogant judge playing his twisted truth or lie game with a helpless pro se defendant, drawing in a crowd of law students, off-duty clerks, and a few skeptical journalists. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced as Judge Montgomery swept into the room, his black robes billowing. He took his seat, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. Mr. Trent, call your first witness for this evidentiary phase, Montgomery ordered, skipping standard procedural pleasantries. Harrison Trent stood, buttoning his suit jacket. The prosecution calls Richard Bancroft to the stand. A murmur went through the crowd as the silver-haired billionaire strode confidently down the aisle. Richard Bancroft, CEO of Bancroft Financial, exuded an aura of untouchable wealth and power. He took the oath and sat in the witness box, shooting a brief, disdainful glare at Camille. Under Trent's direct examination, Bancroft spun a masterful tale. He painted Camille as a disgruntled, greedy employee who had exploited a glitch in the company's internal network to siphon funds into a dummy corporation. He produced glossy charts and internal network logs, all heavily doctored, which Prosecutor Trent entered into evidence. "And, Mr. Bancroft," Trent asked sympathetically, "how did you discover this betrayal?" "Our cybersecurity team caught the anomaly," Bancroft lied smoothly. "We traced the unauthorized server access directly to Miss Washington's terminal. It was a devastating breach of trust." "Thank you. No further questions," Trent said, returning to his seat. Judge Montgomery looked down at Camille. "Miss Washington, you may cross-examine the witness. Try not to waste my time." Camille stood up slowly. She picked up a single sheet of paper and walked toward the podium. She looked incredibly small, standing before the massive wooden witness stand where the billionaire sat. "Mr. Bancroft," Camille began, her voice soft, almost hesitant, "you testified that your cybersecurity team traced the breach to my terminal. Is that correct?" "Yes," Bancroft replied confidently. "And you testified that I transferred the funds into a dummy corporation called Apex Holdings, correct?" "That is what the records show," Bancroft said, smiling a little. Camille looked at Judge Montgomery. "Your Honor, I would like to play truth or lie." Montgomery raised an eyebrow, amused. "You want to play the game again, Miss Washington? Are you a glutton for punishment?" "I am simply following the precedent you established yesterday, Your Honor," Camille said innocently. "I have a statement to make, and I want you to rule if it is a truth or a lie." Montgomery leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "Very well, proceed." Camille turned back to Bancroft, but her eyes flicked to the judge. "It is my statement that the dummy corporation Apex Holdings was actually registered in the state of Delaware on May 12th, exactly 3 years before I was even hired by Bancroft Financial." Trent jumped up. "Objection! She is testifying, not asking a question." "I am playing the court's game, Mr. Trent," Camille replied calmly. "I am making a statement of fact for the judge to evaluate." Montgomery waved Trent down. He looked at the prosecution's files. Trent had not included the incorporation dates of Apex Holdings, assuming a pro se defendant wouldn't know how to pull Delaware corporate registry files. Montgomery, relying purely on his ego and his bias toward Bancroft, made a snap judgment. "Lie," Montgomery declared loudly. "A desperate fabrication by the defendant to distance herself from the stolen funds. The statement is ruled a lie." Camille nodded slowly, making sure Brenda, the court reporter, was getting every word. "So, the court's binding judicial admission is that Apex Holdings was not registered 3 years prior to my employment?" "That is correct," Montgomery snapped. "Move on." "Thank you, Your Honor," Camille said. She then pulled a certified, stamped document from her folder. "Mr. Bancroft, I hold in my hand the certified Delaware State Registry for Apex Holdings. Can you please read the name of the primary listed shareholder?" Trent stood up, his face paling slightly. "Objection, Your Honor. This document wasn't in discovery." "I am a pro se defendant, Your Honor," Camille said, feigning ignorance. "I am simply using public records to ask a question. Surely the prosecution isn't afraid of a public registry?" Montgomery, annoyed by Trent's interruption and confident in his own ruling, sighed. "Overruled." "Let him read it." Bancroft took the paper. His confident sneer faltered. He cleared his throat. "The primary shareholder is listed as Clayton Montgomery." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Brenda's fingers flew across the stenograph. Prosecutor Trent dropped his pen, staring at the witness stand in horror. Judge Montgomery's face drained of all color. "What did you say?" he whispered harshly. "It says, Clayton Montgomery," Bancroft repeated, sweating profusely. "That's a forgery," Montgomery roared, slamming his gavel. "I have nothing to do with any Apex Holdings. Actually, Your Honor." Camille's voice cut through the chaos, suddenly sharp, authoritative, and ringing with absolute confidence. The meek paralegal was gone. In her place stood a legal titan. "It is a perfectly legal blind trust set up by your brother-in-law 7 years ago. A trust that receives quarterly dividends from Bancroft Financial. Montgomery pointed a trembling finger at her. "You are held in contempt. Bailiff, take her." "Wait," Camille commanded, and there was such sheer, dominant force in her tone that the bailiff actually froze. "Your Honor, you just made a binding judicial admission, on the record, that my statement about Apex Holdings being registered 3 years prior to my employment was a lie. Which means, according to your own absolute ruling, Apex Holdings must have been created after I was employed, but the state-certified document proves it was created 7 years ago." She took a step closer to the bench, her eyes blazing with terrifying intelligence. "By ruling my statement a lie, you have judicially admitted that the official state record is false. You have just invalidated your own blind trust's legal standing on the federal record, exposing it to immediate IRS audit, while simultaneously proving that Mr. Bancroft's financial logs, which you just admitted into evidence, are tied to an entity that you have a direct financial interest in." Montgomery was speechless. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. Camille wasn't done. She turned to the stunned prosecutor. "Mr. Trent, according to 28 U.S.C., Section 455, a judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned, especially if he has a financial interest in the subject matter in controversy. By forcing me to play truth or lie, Judge Montgomery just legally bound himself to a paradox that proves his financial conflict of interest on the public record." She looked back up at the bench, her gaze cold and unyielding. "So, Your Honor," Camille asked, her voice echoing in the dead silent courtroom, "truth or lie? Are you going to recuse yourself, or am I going to have to explain to the Judicial Conduct Board how you just admitted to holding a financial stake in a dummy corporation used for money laundering?" The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had shattered Judge Montgomery's entire world. Absolute bedlam seized courtroom 302. Reporters in the back rows scrambled for their phones, tripping over the wooden pews to text their editors. Brenda Hayes, the veteran court reporter, kept her hands hovering over her stenograph, her eyes darting between the paralyzed judge and the formidable young woman standing at the defense table. "Order! Order in my court!" Judge Clayton Montgomery finally bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard the wooden handle splintered. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. "This is a circus. I am striking this entire line of questioning from the record." "You cannot, Your Honor," Camille Washington stated, her voice slicing through the noise with chilling precision. "As I established yesterday, under the federal rules of evidence, and explicitly confirmed by your own ruling, your truth or lie determinations during this hearing operate as binding judicial admissions. A judge cannot retroactively strike a binding admission simply because it exposes his own felony." Prosecutor Harrison Trent looked like he was about to vomit on his $3,000 shoes. He turned to Richard Bancroft, who was gripping the edges of the witness box, his knuckles bone white. Trent suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door, and Camille Washington held the lever. He had blindly trusted a billionaire's forged documents, and in doing so, he had presented perjured evidence to a federal court. "Your Honor," Trent stammered, raising a shaking hand, "the government requests an immediate recess to evaluate the integrity of these documents." "Objection," Camille countered instantly. "The prosecution cannot call a timeout just because they are losing their own rigged game. I have the right to confront my accuser, and Mr. Bancroft is still under oath." She stepped away from the podium, pacing slowly in front of the jury box, which currently sat empty for this preliminary hearing. She didn't look like a terrified paralegal anymore. She moved with the predatory grace of a seasoned litigator closing in for the kill. "Mr. Bancroft," Camille said, pivoting sharply to face the billionaire. "Let's talk about the specific network architecture at Bancroft Financial. You claimed I used a glitch in the firewall to route $3 million to Apex Holdings, but my eidetic memory recalls the exact source code of that firewall, designed by a firm called Ironclad Fiduciary. Tell me, does a Level 4 encryption protocol allow for external bypass without an executive override key?" Bancroft swallowed hard. "I am not a technical expert. My cybersecurity team handles that." But you swore on the record that you traced it to my terminal, Camille pressed, her eyes narrowing. A terminal that lacks executive override clearance. In fact, there are only 2 people in the entire company who possess a Level 4 override key. You, Mr. Bancroft, and your Chief Financial Officer, Arthur Pendleton. So, unless I am Arthur Pendleton in a very convincing disguise, it was physically impossible for me to initiate that transfer. You hacked it, Bancroft shouted, his polished veneer cracking. You're a genius. Everyone knows you're too smart for that paralegal desk. You bypassed it. Truth or lie, Your Honor? Camille asked, looking up at Judge Montgomery. Montgomery shrank back into his leather chair. The arrogant tyrant was gone, replaced by a terrified man, realizing his empire was burning. If he said truth, he admitted Camille was a genius capable of hacking a system Bancroft just claimed was impenetrable, thereby contradicting the prosecution's own technical logs. If he said lie, he exonerated her of the hack entirely. Montgomery remained silent, his breath hitching. I'll take your silence as a concession, Your Honor, Camille noted coldly. She turned back to the gallery. Yesterday, anticipating that this court would attempt to railroad me using falsified documents, I took a precaution. I did not come to this courthouse alone. From the back row of the gallery, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a nondescript gray suit stood up. He walked down the center aisle, bypassing the wooden swing gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He reached into his breast pocket and flipped open a leather credential case, flashing a gold shield. Special Agent Thomas R. Kessler, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, the man announced, his voice deep and gravelly. Miss Washington contacted my office 3 weeks ago regarding a massive, multinational money laundering syndicate operating out of Bancroft Financial. We have been monitoring this hearing with great interest. Trent slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. It was over. The career he had spent a decade building was disintegrating in real time. Agent Kessler, Camille addressed the FBI agent calmly. Can you confirm the current status of the $3 million I am accused of embezzling? I can, Agent Kessler replied, stepping up to the prosecution's table and ignoring Trent entirely. At 11:42 p.m. on October 14th, the funds were indeed transferred. However, they were not sent to the Cayman accounts controlled by Apex Holdings. They were intercepted and rerouted by Miss Washington into a secure, frozen escrow account, monitored directly by the United States Treasury Department. She didn't steal the money. She secured it as material evidence of federal wire fraud. The courtroom fell dead silent. The magnitude of Camille's intellect and foresight hung heavy in the air. She hadn't just stumbled into a trap. She had orchestrated an elaborate, flawless counter-sting operation, using her own arrest to get Bancroft and a corrupt federal judge into the same room, under oath, on the public record. Richard Bancroft looked like a cornered rat. His eyes darted toward the side exits, but 2 federal marshals had already quietly moved to block the heavy oak doors. He looked back at Judge Montgomery, desperate for a lifeline. "Clayton, do something," Bancroft hissed, completely abandoning judicial decorum. "Shut this down. You promised me this would be clean." Another collective gasp echoed through the room. Bancroft had just admitted to ex parte communications and collusion with the presiding judge. Brenda Hayes was typing so fast her fingers were a blur. "Shut up, Richard!" Montgomery screamed back, throwing his gavel onto his desk. "I don't know this man. I am a victim of a sophisticated cyber attack by this defendant." "A victim?" Camille laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. She walked back to her defense table and picked up another thick manila folder. "Let's play one last round of your favorite game, Judge Montgomery, truth or lie." She opened the folder, revealing a stack of bank statements stamped with the seal of a prominent offshore banking institution in Zurich. "Statement 1, Camille began, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "For the past 5 years, Bancroft Financial has been artificially inflating their quarterly earnings reports to drive up stock prices while simultaneously funneling the excess phantom capital into offshore accounts to avoid federal taxation." She didn't wait for him to answer. Statement 2. 20% of those laundered funds are routinely deposited into Apex Holdings, the blind trust registered to your brother-in-law, which subsequently pays your mortgage on your $6 million estate in the Hamptons. Montgomery was openly weeping now, his face buried in his trembling hands. The invincible judge, the terror of the Southern District, was reduced to a sobbing mess. Statement 3. Camille drove the final nail into the coffin. When I discovered this discrepancy while auditing routine paralegal files, Mr. Bancroft realized his syndicate was exposed. He fabricated the embezzlement charges, knowing that the automated federal docket assignment algorithm could be manipulated if he filed the injunction on a specific Tuesday afternoon, guaranteeing the case would land on your desk, Your Honor. He needed his paid-for judge to silence me quickly, quietly, and permanently. Camille closed the folder with a sharp thwack. She looked directly at Montgomery, her dark eyes piercing straight through his shattered ego. So, Judge Montgomery, tell the court, tell Agent Kessler, tell the world, are my statements the truth or a lie? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the frantic tapping of the stenograph. "It's the truth," Montgomery whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up, his eyes hollow and defeated. "It's all true. He made me do it. Bancroft threatened to expose the trust if I didn't help him bury you." "You spineless coward," Bancroft roared, lunging out of the witness box toward the bench. "Federal marshals, restrain that man," Agent Kessler barked. Chaos erupted again as the marshals tackled the billionaire to the ground, snapping heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Bancroft thrashed and cursed, his tailored suit ripping at the seams. Prosecutor Trent slowly stood up. He looked at Camille, his expression a mix of profound awe and absolute terror. "Miss Washington, I had no idea. I swear to God. I just thought it was a standard embezzlement case." Camille looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse, Mr. Trent. Isn't that what you tell the poor, unrepresented defendants you prosecute every day? You failed to verify the integrity of your evidence. You let your bias against my race, my age, and my pro se status blind you to the fact that you were acting as an errand boy for a cartel." Trent swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He knew his career was over. He would be lucky to avoid disbarment, let alone prison time for prosecutorial negligence. Agent Kessler walked up to the bench. "Clayton Montgomery, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Montgomery complied silently, his entire body shaking as the cold steel closed around his wrists. As he was led down from the bench, stripped of his power and his dignity, he paused as he passed Camille's table. "Who are you?" Montgomery rasped, staring at her as if she were a ghost. "You're not just a paralegal. No paralegal could pull this off." Camille offered him a small, cold smile. "I told you yesterday, Your Honor, I am a woman who understands the rules of the game, and I have an IQ of 168. You should have checked my academic transcripts before you tried to play with me." As the disgraced judge was led out of his own courtroom in handcuffs, the gallery erupted into spontaneous applause. Law students cheered, and the skeptical journalists frantically dialed their news desks to break the biggest legal scandal of the decade. Camille Washington stood alone at the defense table. She slowly packed her documents back into her worn manila folder. She had done it. She had dismantled a corrupt billionaire and a tyrannical judge using nothing but her intellect and the very laws they had twisted for their own gain. She walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, ready to leave the paralegal life behind and take the legal world by storm. The game was over, and she had won. 6 months had passed, yet the seismic shockwaves of what the media dubbed the pro se prodigy incident continued to fracture the bedrock of the Southern District of New York. The monumental collapse of Judge Clayton Montgomery and billionaire Richard Bancroft didn't just dominate the evening news. It became a cultural phenomenon. Global financial networks and elite legal publications, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, ran endless exposes on the stunning courtroom reversal. The public hungered for every granular detail of the brilliant young black woman who had legally dismantled two corrupt titans before her morning coffee. But for the men who had orchestrated their own demise, the media spectacle was merely the prologue to a brutal, inescapable reckoning. Karma, meticulously engineered by Camille Washington's staggering intellect, hit with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Clayton Montgomery, once the untouchable gavel-wielding tyrant of courtroom 302, found himself sitting on the wrong side of the defense table in a stark, windowless federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. He was no longer draped in his voluminous, authoritative black robes that had once commanded absolute terror. Instead, he wore a standard-issue, brightly colored, fluorescent orange jumpsuit stamped with the insignia of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His silver hair, previously impeccably groomed by expensive barbers, was thin, greasy, and wild. The arrogant sneer that had defined his 15-year career had entirely evaporated, replaced by the hollow, bloodshot, terrified stare of a man who knew he had nowhere left to hide. Presiding over his sentencing was Chief Judge Eleanor Hastings, a fiercely respected jurist known throughout the appellate circuits for her unshakable integrity and absolute zero tolerance for judicial corruption. Montgomery was forced to stand and listen in excruciating public humiliation as the full, sprawling extent of his crimes was read into the permanent federal record. The IRS, weaponized by Camille's brilliant courtroom maneuver that exposed the Apex Holdings lie, had mercilessly audited his brother-in-law's blind trust. Federal agents had seized the $6 million Hamptons estate, frozen his offshore Zurich accounts, and liquidated his federal pension to pay restitution. His wife, a socialite who cared only for status, filed for divorce the morning after the indictment, taking whatever legally clean assets remained and leaving him with nothing but mounting legal debts. Clayton Montgomery, Judge Hastings declared, her voice echoing through the silent room, completely devoid of any professional sympathy. You took a sacred oath to uphold the sanctity of the law and protect the vulnerable. Instead, you transformed your courtroom into a predatory, customized toll booth, destroying innocent lives to line your own pockets. You mocked the very foundation of our justice system, and worse, you did it with a smile. Hastings slammed her gavel down, sentencing him to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. As the federal marshal's men, who had once respectfully called him Your Honor, clapped the heavy iron cuffs onto his wrists, Montgomery wept openly, his shoulders shaking. He was being sent to a facility housing dozens of men he had wrongfully and maliciously sentenced over the years, a terrifying reality that promised him a daily nightmare of an existence behind bars. Richard Bancroft suffered a similarly spectacular and agonizing downfall. The irrefutable revelation of his money-laundering syndicate, corroborated by the very financial logs his own team had doctored, sent Bancroft Financial's stock plummeting to literal pennies within 48 hours of his courtroom arrest. Panicked and desperate to salvage the company, the board of directors held an emergency midnight vote to permanently oust him, cooperating fully with the Securities and Exchange Commission, who were already seizing servers and hard drives from the executive suites. Stripped of his impenetrable corporate shield, Bancroft was hit with a staggering 72-count federal indictment ranging from wire fraud to witness tampering. Unable to post the unprecedented $50 million cash bail set by the new presiding judge, the disgraced billionaire was remanded directly to Rikers Island. The man who had worn bespoke Italian silk suits and dined exclusively in private Manhattan clubs was now fighting for his basic physical safety in a chaotic, brutally overcrowded cell block. His high-priced, white-shoe defense team abandoned him the moment the government successfully froze his remaining domestic assets. In the ultimate, poetic stroke of justice for a man who had tried to mock a pro se defendant, Bancroft was left completely reliant on an overworked, deeply exhausted public defender who had 90 other open cases on her desk. Prosecutor Harrison Trent did not escape the blast radius of his own arrogance. Although he had not been directly involved in the offshore money laundering, his willing blindness, utter lack of preparation, and highly unethical participation in Montgomery's rigged truth or lie game cost him everything he valued. The New York State Bar Association's Ethics Committee held a swift, ruthless disciplinary hearing and formally stripped him of his license to practice law in any state. Disgraced, financially ruined by legal fees, and virtually unemployable in any white-collar sector, Trent was last seen working as a night shift assistant manager at a sprawling, dusty logistics warehouse in New Jersey. He spent his 15-minute coffee breaks sitting on wooden shipping pallets, deeply regretting the day he underestimated a young black woman without formal representation. Meanwhile, Camille Washington stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding light of her hard-earned victory. With the fabricated charges against her completely expunged from the system, she no longer had to hide her staggering intellect or her secret qualifications. She formally presented her sealed academic waivers, her eidetic memory certifications, and her past bar exam results to the state board. Her swearing-in ceremony was a heavily attended media event, a triumphant coronation for the legal prodigy. The corporate legal world, desperate to associate themselves with the sheer genius who broke the Bancroft Syndicate from the defendant's chair, threw themselves at her feet. Managing partners from elite, real-world white-shoe firms like Cravath, Swain, and Moore, and Kirkland and Ellis offered her unprecedented starting salaries that rivaled corporate CEOs, promising corner offices overlooking Central Park and immediate track to partnership deals. Camille politely, but firmly, declined every single one of them. She hadn't fought this hard, risking her own freedom, just to become another highly paid cog in a massive corporate machine. Using the incredibly substantial, multi-million-dollar whistleblower reward granted to her by the United States Treasury Department for exposing the offshore tax evasion, Camille purchased a sprawling, historic brownstone in Brooklyn. There, she established the Washington Legal Defense Initiative, a private, highly specialized, heavily funded law firm dedicated entirely to representing marginalized individuals who had been targeted, framed, or railroaded by corrupt judicial systems and predatory corporations. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Camille sat behind a massive, polished oak desk in her new office. The walls were lined with heavy, leather-bound legal volumes, and the bright morning sun streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating the framed certifications on the wall. She wore a tailored, immaculate white suit, a sharp, powerful contrast to the worn, baggy navy outfit she had worn in Montgomery's court. She was no longer a victim. She was a conqueror. Her desk intercom buzzed. It was her newly hired senior paralegal. "Miss Washington, your 10 o'clock appointment is here." It's a young man facing a severe federal possession charge. The police evidence logs look highly doctored, full of contradictory timestamps, and the judge assigned to his case has a well-documented history of applying maximum sentencing guidelines exclusively for first-time minority offenders. Camille smiled, her dark eyes flashing with that same terrifying, brilliant intellect that had brought a billionaire empire to its knees. She picked up a sleek silver fountain pen and opened a fresh, crisp legal pad. She knew exactly how to dismantle rigged systems, and she was just getting started. "Send him in," Camille said, her voice warm but forged in absolute, unbreakable steel. "Let's level the playing field." The gavel's final strike shattered an empire of corruption, proving that true power lies not in titles, but in the brilliant, unyielding pursuit of justice. Camille Washington transformed a rigged game into a masterclass of accountability. This saga stands as a stark, real-world warning to those who abuse authority. Arrogance is a fragile shield against a genius mind, and karma, when meticulously legally engineered, never misses its target.